In my previous video on TanStack, we just kind of did an overview and did a basic setup of TanStack, but today we're going to dive into TanStack Router a little bit more. And in case you didn't see my previous video, TanStack Router is basically an alternative to React Router DOM, and there's a lot of really cool features to it, and in some ways it might be a better solution for your projects opposed to using something like React Router DOM or even using Next.js. So today we're going to cover a little bit more of a deep dive into TanStack Router, and we're going to go over kind of the concepts of route trees and nesting. And we will also kind of go over flat routes versus directory routes versus mixed flat directory routes. And then we'll kind of get into some different routing concepts like the root route, as well as the anatomy of a route, static routes, index routes, dynamic route segments, and catch-all routes. And in my next video, I'll cover pathless routes, as well as non-nested routes. And of course, we'll cover more kind of TanStack stuff, because as you can see here, there's a lot of stuff that you can do with it. But before we dive to that stuff, let's just kind of get into route trees, nesting, and some basic concepts of routes. And to do this, we will also be creating just a demo project with Create React App, and I will also have this project linked in the description below. But to just first kind of cover things a little bit more conceptually, let's just go over kind of what it says here in the docs first. And in case you can't see, let me move this down a little bit. I'm just at tanstack.com/router/latest/docs/frameworks/react/guide/route trees. In case you want to go to this URL as well and kind of follow along the docs as I'm kind of covering just some of this briefly here before we dive into the code. So to build a route tree, TanStack Router lets you do file-based routing as well as code-based routing. And then here they go on to mention that they suggest file-based routing as that is routing that requires less code for the same or better results. So their recommended approach is file-based routing. In my previous video, we set up code-based routing. So today we're going to actually do file-based routing. Now, route trees. So nested routing is a powerful concept that allows you to use a URL to render a nested component tree. For example, given the URL of blog/post/123, you can see this kind of hierarchy. And the rendered component tree would be blog, wrapping post with a specific ID. To configure nested routing, TanStack Router uses a route hierarchy called a route tree to organize and match routes. So you'll have a root route, and then within that root route, you might have just an index route, about page, a post page, but then within that post page, you might have an index route, and then you might have a dynamic post page that within posts, you go to a specific post ID, and so on and so forth. Now, route trees can be represented using a number of different ways. You can use flat routes, directory routes, a combination of the two, or code-based routes. But we're going to focus a little bit more on file-based routing, as that's what TanStack recommends here. Now, for flat routes, they all use the same level of nesting. They make it easy to see and find your routes in a project. So I think the core fundamental here is when naming your files, instead of putting stuff in a folder, you just use kind of dot notation. So your kind of about page, just at /about, is just going to be about.tsx or JSX. So that's just very straightforward. Same thing with your post page. But then what if you want to go to /post/ a certain post ID? Well, in this configuration with flat routes, you would just go to posts dot, and then the dynamic route variable here, .tsx. So this would be /post/ ID. So rather than creating a post directory and creating a dynamic page within that directory, you just use dot notation here. And this might be more clear here below to where we have a settings page. So that's just settings.tsx or JSX. And then what if we want a /settings/profile? Well, in a lot of routing systems, you might do within your settings folder, you use a profile folder and render an index.js or a page.js file that's within the profile folder, that's within the settings folder. So that will render at /settings/profile. But if using flat routes, you just create a file name called settings.profile.tsx. And to show you kind of directory routes, it's basically the same thing we're doing above, but instead of doing settings.profile.tsx, well, here we just have a settings directory. And within the settings directory, we have a profile.tsx page. Now you could also do a settings directory and have a profile directory and have an index.ts or JS page within your profile directory. And then to show you the dynamic routes segment, so with directory routes or using folders, you still have your about.ts page goes to /about. But say we want to have /post/post ID. Well, we could have a post directory and then have an index.ts page that matches /posts. But then to create this dynamic page, we have a $post. And I'll cover dynamic routes here in a sec, but you use a $to create a dynamic route. So you have $post ID, which will be /post because we're in the post directory. And then we're at /post ID. So it's a very similar approach, but basically you can use either flat routes by just doing like settings.profile to match /settings/profile, or you can use directory routes to where you might have a settings folder, and within that settings folder, then you could create a profile page, or you could also create a profile folder within the settings folder, but then you would just use index pages to match your routes, which I'll cover a little bit more here in a second. All right, so you can use either flat routes or directory routes to set up your routing. Then this is basically what this says right here. Now, when it comes to case sensitivity, route paths by default are not case sensitive. That means about.ts and about with a bunch of capitals in it are considered the same out of the box. Now, you can configure this differently, but I think in most cases, you'll probably just keep it case insensitive. Now, to dive into some routing concepts a little bit further here, and we will start creating our project here in just a second, we'll have a root route. So the root route is the topmost route in the entire tree and encapsulates all other routes as children. It has no path. It is always matched. Its component is always rendered. Even though it doesn't have a path, the root route has access to all the same functionality as all other routes. So components, loaders, search parameters, etc. To create a root route, this is what the code looks like, and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and create this root route here. So to do this, let's head over to VS Code, and I'm going to create a new Next.js project. So I'm going to do npx create -react-app. I'm going to just call this TanStack Routing Concepts, maybe. And I'm going to create this new create React app. So once this gets created, I'm going to go File, Open, and then open this within VS Code. So I've just opened my project here, and I'm going to close this welcome page. And then in my SRC, I'm going to just get rid of a bunch of stuff here. So get rid of app.css, get rid of app.js, get rid of app.test.js, get rid of index.css. We're not going to mess with CSS in this project. Get rid of the logo, and then get rid of report web vitals. So the first things that we're going to have to do here is we're going to need to install a couple of packages. So let's head back and let's go to installation here for TanStack Router. and we're going to run npm install at tanstack /React router. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it right here. And now with that installed, we're also going to need to set up a couple of other things for creating our route. So click on file-based routing over here in the documentation. And sorry if you just heard my dog growled in the background. I think he's kind of bored, but he'll be taken out a walk here in just a sec. But here on the file-based routes, you can see that we can use Vite to kind of create and configure our routes, but we're actually going to use the router CLI. So let's copy this right here, npm install at tanstack /router CLI. I want to paste this, but I've already done this, but you might need to do -g, npm install -g, and install that there for this to work. But now let's come back, and now we can run, TSR, TanStack Router generate, which will generate the routes for a project. Right now, this is not going to work because we don't have any routes yet, but we are going to run TSR watch, which will basically create the routes as we go. So let's run this. So there's no directories right now, which is expected. Let's open up a new window here and let's run, actually, before we start the project. So we'll leave this running in the background. And before we start the project here, let's set up and I can remove setup tests here as well, our index.js page. So what we need to do here for our index.js page is I'm going to just delete everything here, but we are going to import React from React. We are going to import React DOM from React-DOM /client. And then we're going to import a couple of TanStack stuff. So we're going to do router provider from TanStack Router, create router. So import both of those. And then we're going to import route tree. And that's going to be from /route tree.gen.ts. And we don't have this in our project yet, but we will in just a second. Once we start creating routes, this watcher here is going to automatically generate our route tree, which I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. Then we're going to say const router is equal to create router, and then pass in the route tree. And then we're going to say const root element is equal to document.get element by ID. And this can be the ID of root, just like you normally do when I create React app. And we'll just do a check here. If not, root element dot inner HTML. And we will say const root is equal to React DOM dot create root. So if there's not a root, create a root with our root element here. And then we will call root dot render. And then we will render our router provider, where our router is set to our router. So this configuration here, and this should actually be, instead of a router tree, it should just be route tree. So this configuration here will take our route tree that's going to be automatically generated for us when we start creating our routes. And what generates that is our CLI here. It's this kind of watcher here to generate routes within our routes directory, which we will create in a second. And then once it generates our route tree, it will basically render our route tree within our ID of root here, within our index.html page that Create React App uses, and that will render basically our application, all of our different routes. Let's come back here and let's go back to route trees and nesting. And we need to create our root route here. So the way that we're going to do this is, before we create our root route, we need to create a routes directory. So let's come back to VS Code. Within the src folder, create a new folder called routes. or routes. I'm not actually sure what is correct. And then within our routes folder, we also need to create a root page. So this is going to be at __root.jsx. So new file __ root.jsx. And we're doing this in JavaScript just in case you're not familiar with TypeScript and to keep this a little bit more simple. Now, as you can see, it automatically generates some code here for us. And this is just a TanStack thing to where when we create this, it's automatically going to create some different routes. But we'll just get rid of all this for now. And we're going to import React from React, and we're going to import a few different things from TanStack. So within our root route here, this is basically just going to be our navigation component. And this is going to render on all of our pages because it's our root route. So this is basically going to be like the root layout of our project. So we're going to import a link, an outlet, which I'll go into outlets deeper in future videos, and then a create root route function from at /TanStack React router. And then we need to create our root route. So I'm going to export the const route that's equal to create root route. And then we need to pass in an object. And what do we need to pass in? Well, there's several things that we can pass in, but right now we want to pass in a component. And then we need to set that to what we want to render as like our root layout or our root route. So we're going to create a root component here. So let's create a function called a root component. And then let's return a React fragment. And then we'll return let's just do a div here. And then we'll return a link from React router, the link that we imported above. And then within this link, I'm going to name this home, and it's going to route to our home route. So this works like many other links in like many other routers, like React router or even Material UI, in which we set it to prop. And then this is just going to navigate. And I think I have an extra quote there, but this is just going to navigate to the home page or the root route. And then we'll do the same thing here, but we will create an about page. So this will just be /about. And then later on, we will also create a posts page. So this will be /posts. Let me change this text to about and posts. And then below this, we want to render out our actual page. So this is basically just like our navigation. I guess I can change this to our nav here. And let me close that. But below this, we want to render out our actual pages. So to do this, let's render out a horizontal rule. But we want to render out an outlet, which is basically telling TanStack we want to render out the rest of our children, the rest of our component tree here below our navigation here within our root route. All right, we will dive into outlets in future videos further, but just know that this is telling TanStack here that we want to render out our page below our kind of navigation element. So this renders out our root route here. And as you can see, when we created this root route, it automatically generated this file right here, this file called routetree.gen.ts. And this basically just is TanStack automatically generating the route tree for our application. So you can see it has our root route. It automatically generates __ root. And then it creates our route tree and exports that by adding children, similar to what we did kind of manually with the code-based solution we did prior. So now we can import root route from this file because it was automatically generated. So this should all work. But before we go back and test this out, within our routes folder here, let's create an index page. So this is going to render, or it's going to map to and let me make this JSX. This is going to be our just root page at /. And it's different because __ root, this is just basically rendering our navigation, but we want to still render our / page because this is not rendering like a home page right now. It's just a wrapper around all of our other pages. It's our root route. So we want to render our home page right here. So for this home page here, as you can see, it automatically generates some stuff here for us, but we'll just kind of get rid of that. And I'll import React from React. I'll import create file route from TanStack Router. And now we need to create our home route. So we're going to export const route is equal to create file route. And then we need to pass in our root route, or whatever route we want this to match to. And we want this to match to our home path right now. And then next to this, we are going to invoke the function returned from create file route. And we're going to call a component, and we're going to create a home component. And then we're going to create a function called home component. And then we will just return maybe, and I need to spell return right. So return, and then maybe just a main tag that has an H2 saying welcome home. So this is going to create a root file here at just /. It's going to be a home component. It's going to render this out. And when you call create file route, that's going to return a function that we are going to immediately invoke to pass in our component that we want to render here. And then as you're going to see in routetree.gen, it automatically generates our index route here at path /. Now it automatically generates this. So if we come back to the docs here, as you can see, for the anatomy of a route, all of the routes other than the root route are configured using the file route class. The file route class is a wrapper around root class that provides type safety. So you can see the way that you call this is create file route, path name, call the function return from that, which is a component that you want to render out at this route. Now, as you can see, the create file route path argument, it's a function that takes a single argument, the file route's path. And then it says here, so you're saying you're making me pass the path of the route file to create file route. And it says yes, but don't worry, this path is still automatically written and managed by the router for you. You just do this for basically type safety. So yeah, the reason for this has everything to do with the type safety of TanStack Router. So like it still generates this automatically here for you, but it's just making you pass this in for type safety reasons. All right, so let's move forward. And we've already been creating some static routes here, but let's continue with static routes. Then we will cover index routes here after. So what we have now is at just /, we should see our home page here. So I'm going to go ahead and you can see now our watcher is generating routes. But if I just run npm start, it should open this up at localhost 3000. And as you can see, module not resolved. And I actually see what's going on here. So I named this ROUTE, but this should actually be root instead of ROOT. So it should be ROOT.jsx. I'm going to click yes here, which is kind of confusing. I keep confusing route and root. But let's come back. Okay, it looks like everything's going on. I'm not quite sure what's going on there. I think I just maybe accidentally bumped something in that file, but just make sure that this is routes __ root is your root route. So now what we can see is that we do render out our root navigation here at home, about, and posts. And then we see our welcome home page. So let's now go ahead and just create a static path. So a static route is just simply matching a specific route. So /about, /settings, /settings to profile. Like there's nothing dynamic about it. And the way that you do this is just how we created our home route. So I'm going to actually just copy this page here. And then within my routes folder, let's create a new file and call this about.jsx. And here I'm going to remove everything in this file and just paste in what we saw in their docs here. So we create file route, we call that function, we export that route that we create from create file route, we pass in the path we want to match, and then also we call it the second time here, and we make the component, this about component, that will render this about page right here. And if I come back to our app and I go to /about, we see not found, but let me refresh this page here, and it is now found. We just had to make it compile again. So home and now about. So that is just a static path here, making it /about. So very straightforward to create just a static path. Now, it also mentions index routes. So index routes specifically target their parent route when it is matched exactly, and no child route is matched. We can see this above route tree when you are at post.index.tsx. So if you create a post.index.tsx page, you create it very similar here. But in this example, the post.index.tsx page is nested under the post directory. So it will only be matched at /post exactly. So that to be, was it like crazy clear? But all they're talking about here is if I want to use index routes instead of just like static routes here. So instead of using /about, I would use, instead of just about.jsx, I could create a new folder and make this be called about. And then within my about folder, I can just, let's move about.jsx in my about folder, and we'll update the imports. But I'm going to just rename this to index.jsx. So now that I have an about folder and I have an index.js file within my about folder, that means this is going to route to /about. And you can see it automatically created this for us here. Create file route at /about. And it is just our index page here. It's our index.js page. So it's just going to match about /. So if we come back and I refresh here, and I go to home, I go to about, you can see I still render my about page just like we did before, but now I'm using a directory route here or an index route rather than just a static route to where I just created an about page within my routes folder. Either one is fine, but I do kind of like this directory method instead of just the flat method, but either one is totally fine. So we have our home page that will render just within our routes folder here because it's an index.js page. And then we have at /about here because we have an about folder. We're going to render this index.js page. Now, what if I wanted to render /about /settings? Well, I could just create a new file here or a new folder. So I could do new file at settings.jsx. And then you can see it automatically creates this route at /about /settings. So if I come back here and I go to /settings, you can see about /about /settings. But this would be the same exact thing if within my about folder, I created a new folder and I called this settings. And then within my settings folder, let's move this settings page here. I'm going to create an index.jsx page. And now you can see this is still going to map to /about/settings here, because within my routes folder, I have my about folder. So that's /about, and that's going to render my index.js page within my about folder. And then within my about folder, I have a settings folder with an index.js page. So that's going to be /about/settings. So let's refresh here, make sure it all still works. And you can see it does indeed still work here. All right. So you can either use index routes or just static routes when configuring your kind of route tree. So this is Editor Ryan here. Really quick note. So static routes and index routes, they don't have the exact one-to-one functionality with each other. Static routes here simply match a specific path, whereas index routes specifically target their parent route when it is matched exactly and no child route is matched. All right, so there are just very kind of subtle differences between the two. We will actually see this a little bit later on when I cover catch-all routes, so stay tuned for that. But just wanted to make it more clear here that these aren't exactly one-to-one in functionality, and there are some subtle differences here when it comes to which routes are matched when using static routes versus index routes. But we also have dynamic route segments. So what if I want to create a post page, and then that post page should render a dynamic post depending on what the post ID is? Well, here, to create a dynamic route, you use a $sign to prefix it. So let's go ahead and let's create a post page here. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to use flat routes here. So within routes, I'll just create a post.jsx page. And as you can see, it automatically generates /post, hello post. So if I go to /post here, let me refresh. And if I go to, and it should be /posts, plural. Let me rename this quick, /posts, plural. And then now let me refresh. You see I go to hello post, and it should be hello posts, like so. And refresh, and we do now see it. So we have about and posts. But what if I want to go to like, post /1 and see my first post, and post /2, I see my second post. Well, the way that you can do a dynamic route here, as you can see in their docs, is using this $sign post ID format. So we could do this in a couple different ways. I could either create a new file within my routes folder here called posts.$postid.jsx, or I could create a folder called posts. And within that post folder, I create a $postid.jsx page. We'll just use the static route here. So I'm going to do posts.$postid.jsx. And what you're going to see here is it automatically creates this dynamic route here, in which this route is going to map to /post/$post ID. But this $sign is saying this is dynamic. So this can be any value right here. So it could be post /1, post /2, but then we would ideally then use that value to go fetch that dynamic post and go get post number 1, post number 2, post number 3, so on and so forth. So how can we access this post ID? Well, we can access it by using route.useParams. So let's actually just copy this right here and then come back. And I'm going to go ahead and let's actually go ahead and just copy this whole page. And then I'm going to copy, paste. We are not going to worry about the loader right now. But for a post component, I think this was a typo in their docs. It should actually be capital route.useParams. We'll also console log post ID. So now if we go to /post / a certain ID, we can access that ID using route.useParams and then access the post ID. Now it's important that you match. The property of the params is going to match whatever you label this right here. So $post ID is going to match the property of post ID within your params. And if this was just ID, then we would just use ID right here. I'll show you that in just a sec. But if we come back here and within our router, I go to /1 and we don't see it working right now. And the reason why is because we're actually still matching post.jsx here to this page. So for right now, just to demonstrate this, let's just delete post.jsx. The way that we can make both of these work is we would just create a folder called posts, have an index file match that post page, and then we would create a post ID.jsx page, or we could also make this exact here. But the simplest solution right now to make things a little less complicated is just to delete your post.jsx file. All right, so delete that. So you should just have your posts.$postid.jsx page. So now if we come back and I refresh, I should see post ID 123 because I went to post /123. If I go to 12, I see post ID of 12. If I go to 1, I see post ID of 1 because we have our post ID in our dynamic route path here. Now, what if I just change this to $ID? Well, to do that, I'm going to change this here as well to just $ID, and that's $ID. And then here, it's not going to be post ID anymore. It's just going to be ID. And this is going to be ID, and this is going to be ID. So this is just showing you that what you use as your file name here needs to match your route, and it needs to match your params that you're expecting to get. So if we come back, everything still works here. I can type in a bunch of numbers, and this is going to be our dynamic route here. So that is how you can implement dynamic routes in TanStack here as well. Now, we can also do a catch-all route. So the way that we can do this is what you're going to see is right now, if we go to /post / this dynamic ID /post, it's not found because our dynamic route, it's not going to catch this route. It's only going to catch if we go to / some ID. It's not going to catch that ID plus more routes after that. But what if we wanted to capture that for some reason? Well, instead of using ID here, we can just rename this to a blank $. So that is just going to be a catch-all route. And then instead of getting an ID here, we're just going to get some, we'll just call this data, and we won't destructure anything. And then we will just console log this data, and let's not return anything. So this is now going to make this a catch-all route, which if I refresh, you see it does render our post page, and we can see the data that we get here is our kind of param right here. It's our catch-all route. So if you want to do a catch-all route instead of a dynamic route, so you don't just catch this page when it goes to an ID, but you do the ID and then / some other route / some other route, you're going to catch all those. So if you want to do a catch-all route, you would just use a $sign instead of $sign plus a certain param. Okay. So that is kind of a rough overview of creating a route tree, dynamic routes, catch-all routes, index routes, static routes. I know it was a lot, but I think, all that kind of had to be together to make a lot of sense. But in our next video, we will cover a little bit more here when it comes to pathless routes and non-nested routes, just to not make this crazy, crazy long. So hope you learned a lot from this, and I will see you in that next one.